Welcome to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast, where you get help and guidance through the chaos of parenting a child with anxiety or OCD. This show is for educational purposes and is not intended to replace the guidance of a qualified professional. Here's your host, child therapist, Natasha Daniels.
Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. Today, I'm going to help you build even more of an understanding of OCD. We're going to dive deep into magical thinking because a lot of our kids have magical thinking compulsions, and understanding how different compulsions show up, the difference between a compulsion and an OCD theme. It's all part of my effort to educate you and arm you with an incredible knowledge of OCD so that you are really skilled at identifying and supporting your child. But before we dive into that, I do want to thank NoCD for sponsoring this episode. NoCD offers affordable, effective, convenient therapy, and they're available in the US and outside of the US. You can schedule your free 15-minute consultation to see if NoCD is the right fit for you and your child. Just go to treatmyocd.com. That is treatmyocd.com. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Also, I have a new physical product. I have an OCD card deck. And so if you have been wanting to find a creative way to build your child's OCD skills, and whether they are new to fighting OCD or are in the maintenance stage of OCD, I created this card deck so that kids, teens, young adults, and even adults, it's really, there's no age limit or gap in this card deck, that you can pull a card every day and it builds a skill. And there's 4 categories in the card deck. And so there are action cards that are based on ERP, exposure response prevention, the go-to method to help people with OCD. There is motivational cards to work on that motivational piece. There are self-worth cards to work on the self-esteem that often takes a hit. And there are support cards that incorporate the loved ones that are trying to support them. So you can check that out at natashadaniels.com/shop, and I'll take you to my Etsy store where you can find my OCD card decks. And also, just for fun, I have created a bunch of t-shirts, sweatshirts, and tote bags to support people with mental health. So I hope that you find that fun and inspiring. Okay, let's dive into today's topic, helping kids with OCD and magical thinking. I want to start with what is magical thinking. Sometimes I hear people saying things like, my child has magical thinking OCD. You don't have magical thinking OCD. It's not an OCD subtype. It is just a way that a compulsion can show up. It's a type of compulsion. And so you have OCD, the overarching disorder, where you have an intrusive thought or feeling and the need to do or avoid something to get brief relief. And so there's 2 components to OCD, the intrusive thought or feeling and the compulsion, whether it's mental, physical, or involving parental or loved one involvement. That's the compulsion, or avoidance. Avoidance can be a compulsion as well. And then we have different subtypes of OCD that aren't in like the DSM criteria of OCD. They're just names that we've come up with because they're so common. So you have moral OCD and harm OCD and symmetry OCD. And we have all these names just to understand the subtype of how OCD shows up. And then there are certain types of compulsions. You have contamination type of compulsions. You have magical thinking type of compulsions. So I want to talk about that today. And with magical thinking, there is this thought, this intrusive thought that says, if you do not do or not do this particular thing, and we'll talk about that, then X, Y, and Z will happen. That's the framework of magical thinking. You do or you don't do this, or this thing will happen, or this thing won't happen. Most of the time it's preventing something from happening. But it's another way for OCD to hijack our kids' brains and boss them around. I feel like OCD is very threatening. It's a very bullyish, threatening presence. And with magical thinking, it gives them this ownership and this responsibility to prevent something from happening. With magical thinking, it gives our kids this ability to think they have control over something that's not controllable. It's that fallacy of, if I just do this, or if I just don't do this, I have the power to change the events that will unfold. And so that's the gist of it. Sometimes just right OCD and magical thinking kind of combine. And so a lot of times when we look at just right OCD, which is a subtype, we look at it as it's not a fear, it's a feeling. And so I just feel uncomfortable or incomplete until it feels just right. So I have to do it. The compulsion is to do it over and over again until it feels just right. Disgust OCD is also a feeling, not a fear. The fear is I won't be able to handle this feeling. So something is disgusting. So my compulsion might be to avoid it or to wash it off of me. Just giving you like a general understanding of OCD. That's always my goal, is just to educate you more and more and more. But sometimes just right OCD can have magical thinking compulsion. So I need to do this just right until it feels just right. And if it doesn't feel just right, then X, Y, and Z can happen. And so it's kind of like an overlap of the core fear being a feeling. It has to feel just right, but there's this extra threat attached to it. That's not always the case with just right OCD. In fact, most of the time it's not. A lot of the time it is, I just have to do it over and over again until it feels just right. And if I don't, I won't be able to handle the discomfort. There's no like, I'm going to prevent something bad from happening, but sometimes they do team up. So I just wanted to educate you on that. And depending on the theme, that kind of dictates what kind of magical thinking threat there is that your child is trying to prevent. So let's talk about some of these things and how you identify that, and then how do you help your kids with it. And so when we're identifying it and you're asking your child, if you didn't tap, what does OCD will happen? Often you can get some very general responses like something bad will happen. And they may not know specifically what bad thing will happen. They might just say, I just feel like something bad will happen if I don't do it. And there is this overall kind of doomsday feeling that OCD can give people, that it just feels like something bad's going to happen. I need to prevent that. More often than not, though, there is a specific core fear and related subtype that is driving the magical thinking compulsion. And so asking our kids things like, I always like to say, what does OCD say will happen? Because I feel like that takes the ownership off of the person. It takes the shame and embarrassment off of the person, because the curse of OCD is that there is insight for most people. Not all people. If you have an autistic child with a co-occurring struggle with anxiety or OCD, there's not always insight there. But for most people with OCD, there is the insight of knowing this thought is irrational or these compulsions are irrational. And intellectually, I know that I'm not saving the world by knocking 3 times or preventing myself from throwing up, but I need to do it just in case. It's the just in case aspect. And so when we ask our kids things like, what do you think is going to happen if you knock 3 times? That inadvertently gives them this feeling of shame and embarrassment, because it's communicating to them, and it's not our intention, but it's communicating to them, for some people, the message of like, why on earth do you think that you knocking 3 times is going to prevent me from dying? Like, why would you think that? And most of us are not meaning that when we say, what do you think will happen if you don't knock 3 times? But people with OCD are so sensitive to already feeling really embarrassed and stupid, honestly, for having to do these things, that we have to be really sensitive with how we question them. So saying things like, what does OCD say will happen? Just that little shift, just the semantics of that, alter the feeling of that question. And I've seen this, when you're doing therapy day in, day out for over 20 years, you really learn that you learn how to ask questions in a way that are going to give you responses. Because when you sit there for 8 to 10 hours a day, getting bad responses or no responses, you quickly learn how to adapt, And so I have learned over the years, both in my clinical practice and with my own 3 kids, what types of questions can move the dial. And, you know, when a wall is up, a wall is up, and it doesn't matter how beautifully you're going to ask a question. If they're not willing or able to communicate, they're not going to. But these tweaks can actually really move the dial. So what does OCD say will happen if you don't do that, right? So if they have a compulsion where they have to do something, what does OCD say will happen if you don't do that? If they have to avoid something, sometimes magical thinking can be the reverse. You know, I can't sit there or something bad will happen. Something like that, or I can't touch that or something bad will happen. Different than contamination. If I can't sit there, a lot of times that's a contamination compulsion. You know, it's contaminated. I can't sit there. I'll be contaminated. That's not magical thinking. But I can't sit on the left side or we're going to get a car accident, right? That's not contamination. That's magical thinking. And so you might say, well, what would happen? What does OCD say will happen if you did sit on the left side? And so, you know, whether they're doing something or not doing something, that's the kind of questioning that you want to ask. Because when you get an answer, you start to figure out what that core fear is. And you can also start to see what maybe the OCD subtype is. There is a difference between core fears and OCD subtypes. And if you think about it, like, let me try to give you an example. I'm really like trying to educate you on all sorts of things on this episode for some reason, but I just want to give you a full picture. You know, if my child is afraid of losing control in front of other people and that it would be mortifying or embarrassing, that's her core fear. But she has multiple themes. She has sensory motor OCD. She has emetophobia. She has social anxiety. But all three of those, when you kind of go down the rabbit hole, she's afraid if she throws up, she'll lose control and people will judge her and not like her. If she has sensory motor OCD and she wets her pants, which has never happened, that'd be embarrassing, loss of control, people will judge her, she'll lose friends. Same core fear throughout multiple themes. Not only multiple themes, but multiple disorders. So her social anxiety, emetophobia, sensory motor OCD, we're crossing disorders now, but all the same core fear. And most people have one or two core fears and in their lifetime have many different subtypes of OCD, you know, different ways that OCD shows up. It's all still OCD. And maybe even different subtypes of anxiety, different anxiety themes. So that's good to be aware of. And we want to understand that because that's how we actually can help our kids. So after the break, I'm going to go through some steps that you can take with your child, teen, or young adult to help them with magical thinking compulsions. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
It's time we put help directly in our kids' hands. Introducing Crushing OCD course for kids and teens.
It was way more helpful than all the other therapy we've ever done because we didn't really know what to do. So we weren't really doing it before. So the course helped to figure out what the exposures are and how to do them.
We're not in therapy and find it really hard to find an ERP trained therapist here. So we're currently with like the public health service, but again, they don't seem to be trained in ERP. It's filled that gap that we don't have that was desperately needed.
This was really well timed for us to use between therapists and to help us get off to a good start with this new practice.
It was easy to use. I was able to do it from my phone or also on the computer.
There's different ages, so there were younger kids, there were teenagers, and so that was really nice too, to have a variety of ages where it wasn't just geared towards younger kids or older kids. It was a nice variety.
It's helpful for our kids to hear it from this third party as opposed to just us saying it.
I really like the offense and defense method. I love working on poking at OCD while it's sleeping. It makes it a little bit easier to do, and it's kind of fun. I'm planning on using it to work on my fear of holding or touching batteries and stuff like that.
So it was really helpful, and I think a lot of other kids would like it. I thought that I was the only one who had worrying about the weather and stuff. And then there was somebody else on there who worried about the same thing, which was really helpful.
Seems less scary to work on stuff now that I've watched this class, and I'm more interested to work on it.
I like trying to do more exposures still, and before I wasn't, I just didn't want to do them.
I've worked on some of my bigger compulsions and been successful
I realized that it was helpful to do like the exposures. Before it was like really, really hard. It's still hard, but it's helpful to know that I need to do them.
Before there would be a lot of battles about it, so it is definitely less loggerheads.
Really, really good course and super helpful.
Definitely would recommend this. It's really easy to follow. It's nice bite-sized videos. I really like the worksheets that go along with it, and I think it's really helpful.
To learn more about this course and register your child or teen, go to atparentingsurvivalschool.com. Welcome back. Okay, so in the first half of this episode, we talked about what magical thinking is, how to look at what OCD subtypes are versus compulsions, how to understand core fears versus OCD subtypes. And I think you have a good overall understanding of all that. But what do we do with our kids? Ideally, we want to engage them in a conversation. So we also talked in the first half about how to ask questions in a way that won't shut them down. Now, if someone's already shut down, like I said before, it's a trap. Like you can't open that. But there are ways that we can ask questions that kind of encourage a response. I do have a YouTube video on explaining to kids, teens, and young adults what magical thinking compulsions are. And I will link that in the show notes so that you can have them watch that. I always feel like the first step is education in any topic that we're discussing. So educate them on what magical thinking compulsions are. Just because they have things doesn't mean they understand it. So just because they might have an OCD subtype doesn't mean they're like, oh, I have sensory motor OCD, or oh, my core fear is this. A lot of times they're not being difficult by not telling you these things. They honestly don't know, and they have to be walked through it themselves. So the education piece is that key. It unlocks that door and it fills them with knowledge to connect the pieces. It's the missing puzzle piece. Like they know these are the things that they're dealing with, but they don't know that other people are dealing with it. They don't know there's a name for it. They don't know how it works in their brain, and they don't know how to overcome it. So have them watch the YouTube video first. And if you have a child who's on the fence, they're not like some of you might have kids, teens, young adults who are like, we can't even discuss this. Like I can't even broach the subject. Then you have to work on trust and communication. That's a whole other podcast episode. And I've done episodes on that. You can always go to my website at atparentingsurvival.com. Go to the search button. It's at the bottom of the page and type in like trust and communication, and all the work that I've done around that will pop up. But if you have a child on the fence, you can always incentivize them. I know it's hard for you to learn about OCD. I know it's hard for you to talk about OCD. And so, to celebrate your bravery, if you want to watch this YouTube video, which is under 5 minutes long, I think, I don't remember. I have to look it up. You can earn blah, blah, blah. It's okay to incentivize our kids to make brave moves. And yes, watching a video on OCD is a brave move for some kids. That's too much for some kids. Now, some of you have kids who want the help. They want to normalize it. They just want to know what's going on. You don't have to incentivize them. But for those of you that do have kids that are on the fence and you are able to incentivize them, because some kids you aren't, it's worth a try. Once they understand what magical thinking compulsions are, and normally what happens when kids watch these videos and are struggling with this, there's this aha, like, oh my gosh, yes, that's me. Sometimes kids are defensive and they're like, that's not me, I'm not dealing with it. And they're really doubling down on digging their heels in and not engaging. And that does happen. And that just tells you that there needs to be more work on normalizing OCD in general. But for a lot of kids who are in that spot of just needing to be educated, there's a relief in seeing something mirrored back to them on YouTube that is exactly what they're going through. So have them watch the video and then have them identify what compulsions are magical thinking. What different compulsions do you do that OCD says if you don't do it, something bad's going to happen? So you start writing out these compulsions. And then you can have them write out in the next column, if they're willing and able, some kids won't be, what does OCD say will happen if you don't do this? And so it's a really simple way to just kind of start to document the patterns that are happening. And, you might say to your child, let's take 48, 72 hours, whatever, and start to recognize what compulsions you're doing that involve OCD threatening you, that if you don't do it, or if you do it, right, because it can go both ways, what OCD is saying will happen. And so have them kind of write down the things that they're doing and then write down the threat, the OCD threat that is happening with it. And then look at that together. Are you seeing patterns? What patterns are you seeing? Are they all about, keeping you alive, right? Some magical thinking involve things like, I don't want my family to die. And so if I do all these things, I'm keeping them alive. Are you seeing patterns that are, if I do this, I won't throw up? Emetophobia, the fear of throw up, has a lot of magical thinking compulsions for some people. And so are you seeing those things? Are you seeing magical thinking things where if I just do this, then I'm not going to get a migraine? I've seen that a lot where people have health issues and then they attach magical thinking compulsions to their health issues. If I tie my shoelaces a certain way, I won't get a migraine today. Are they doing magical thinking exposures to keep the world safe? If I do this, then nothing bad will happen in the world, or there'll be no shootings, or there'll be no fires. Sometimes it's global with magical thinking. So looking for those patterns can be really helpful because you want to address the core fear through exposure response prevention, ERP. And ideally, you want to get a therapist to work with you on these things. Or if you have a therapist, this has happened a lot, especially in the AT parenting community. The parents that I work with eventually know more than the therapist, or they know as much as a therapist, and they become almost a co-therapist in a mom or dad hat sort of way, helping the therapist spot, understand, and realize what type of subtypes are happening, what type of core fears are present, because you are with your child 24/7. You have a front seat for all the things that are going on. They have 50 minutes per week, if that, to put the puzzle pieces together. And that is with your child, teen, or young adult curating what things they're going to share with them, which often is very limited. And so you have eyes and ears on the front line of what's happening. So sharing this information with your therapist and getting them to do exposures or working with them to see that some exposures addressing these core fears, fear of throwing up, right? Fear of my loved one dying. These are the core fears. And we can go deeper for the core fear. The emetophobia, the fear of throw up, that's not the core fear. We can go even further and it's like maybe embarrassment around other people, or maybe the burn or the sensation of how it will feel. Whatever that core fear is, you want that involved in the exposure. And this episode and this podcast in totality is not for you to just randomly go out and do exposures. You need training on some level to understand how to do that. And so find an OCD therapist, go to NoCD at treatmyocd.com. They have qualified therapists and they are virtual. So they're in, I think, all 50 states and they're global too. So find an OCD trained therapist. A lot of therapists, most therapists are not trained in ERP. And so you have to be very particular and you have to look at their expertise. If they're just saying CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and they're not mentioning ERP, you might want to ask them, do you do ERP? And if they're like, I don't know what that is, but I do CBT, I'd probably get my running shoes on if I'm dealing with OCD because I want someone who at least knows about ERP as a baseline of whether I would go see them or not. If you don't have access to a therapist for all sorts of reasons, there's financial barriers, there's access to care, there's the willingness of our kids, then educate yourself on how to do exposures. I have courses on how to, do ERP at home. It's not something you just want to willy-nilly do and not have the skills to do it. You can check out my courses at atparentingsurvivalschool.com. There are books that you can take. There are resources out there to learn these things, but you do need to learn them. And so this episode isn't about teaching you how to do exposures on the core fear because that's a fundamental skill. That's a foundational skill dealing with OCD in general. But we're just talking about how magical thinking plays into that, right? So once you get to the core fear, now you have the power to do effective exposures because you're addressing that part. The other thing that I normally do when I'm talking to people about magical thinking is I warn them, and we do this in the AT parenting community. We have a kid and teen support group call once a month. And those are two separate calls, one with kids and one with teens. And we've had some kids in there for years. It's actually been phenomenal. And this is part of the AT parenting community. It's just another perk and benefit that people get from the AT parenting community. And they'll talk about their compulsions and stuff. And and some kids will encourage, other kids will give advice, and I'm there moderating it, making sure that it's clinically sound. And a lot of times kids will say, don't do what OCD is bossing you around to do. Don't do that thing and see what happens. And I normally sprinkle in at that point a caveat, and I say, when you stop doing a magical thinking compulsion, this is something to sprinkle in with your kids as well. OCD will make you see patterns that don't exist. It's like if I said to you, from now on, I want you to look at every green car, or I want you to notice every green car. All of a sudden, you're seeing green cars everywhere. Have you ever had the situation where you want to buy a new car, and all of a sudden you're seeing them everywhere? You're like, wow, this all of a sudden is a really popular type of car. It's not. Your brain is selective. It can't focus on absolutely everything. And so when it has a purpose and it wants to find something, it will make sure that you notice it. We're only noticing a small percentage of our world because our brain cannot take in absolutely everything that we're seeing, smelling, touching, and feeling at one given time. And so it's selective. But when your brain is trained, I want to look for green cars, all of a sudden it's like, by the way, there's one, and there's one, and there's one. You'll see it. Unfortunately, the same thing is true when you're looking for patterns of proving your OCD right. So if I have to knock 3 times to prevent, quote unquote, just something bad happening, my OCD is going to be like, oh my gosh, you dropped your pencil. That was horrible. The teacher yelled at you today. That was horrible. Oh, we had to stop short when we stopped at that stop sign. We could have almost gotten killed. That was horrible. And by the end of the day, OCD will be like, because you didn't knock 3 times, you had a horrible day and all these bad things happen, because it will see patterns. Same thing is true for anything else. If I'm knocking 3 times to make sure I am not going to throw up, well, all of a sudden the whole day I felt really nauseous. So letting our kids know that we're not trying to prove magical thinking wrong. Sometimes therapists do take that approach. Like if you say, if I don't knock 3 times, my parent's going to die. Well, OCD can to me, it can run circles around your brain. It could be like, well, maybe not today, but it might happen tomorrow, or it might happen the next day. So for me, I never take the approach of we're going to prove magical thinking wrong. Let's do it and see. Did you survive that? I'm going to preface it with saying OCD is going to look for patterns. I'm going to tell them the story about the green car. I'm going to let them know how the brain works and how it's got selective focusing. And I'm going to say OCD will really try to convince you that you were not able to prevent this bad thing from happening. But here's the deal. And this is where I work on mindset, like a mindset shift. Not that this is going to necessarily move the dial, because you can't, in my opinion, rationalize someone out of OCD, but it's the cherry on top, in my opinion. And so I'm going to say things like, it's fascinating that OCD says that you can prevent bad things from happening. Like people will be lining up for that superpower. And so can you prevent, me from having gas today because my stomach is hurting? Can you prevent this from happening? Kind of making light of it and showing them the bigger nonsensical picture of what OCD is trying to tell them can sometimes get them out of the bubble of what OCD is having them live in. It's not going to 100% move the dial, but it is another cherry thing on top that I like to sprinkle in. I'll also say, if OCD says you can prevent bad things from happening, then the opposite should be true too. Can you make good things happen? Can we win the lottery tomorrow? Can we, and come up with some different scenarios. Can you do that? Can that happen? Well, how come it works one way but not the other? Isn't that interesting? So getting them to kind of get outside of their fears and seeing the ridiculousness of OCD can add just another element. Again, like I said, it's not going to move the dial 100%, but all of these things add up. The main mover and shaker is 2 things: offense and defense. And I will leave, I have a YouTube video on offense and defense, and I'll leave it in the show notes as well. But the 2 main approaches that we want to take with OCD at any given time is offense and defense. This is my language. This is how I talk to people about it. And defense is, okay, OCD's knocking and it's saying, oh my gosh, you better wear your red socks today or something bad's going to happen. You're going to throw up or your family's going to die. And then that's defense. OCD's bossing me around. And so I might try to do the opposite. I might say, I'm not going to wear my red socks. Or maybe I wear one red sock and the other one is not a red sock. And so I'm messing with OCD's rules. I'm halfway giving in, but not 100%. And And that's hard because that's a big exposure in itself for someone with magical thinking compulsions to do something that is not exactly the way that it's supposed to be to prevent something bad from happening. So it's a big step. A lot of times with other compulsions, we can do smaller steps or even just delay it. With magical thinking, it's hard because all of it can feel like just going off a cliff. But starting to do defense and question, do I really need to do this? Can I delay it? Like maybe I'm going to just delay wearing my red socks or delay knocking until I can't stand it anymore. Or can I ignore it and not wear the red socks? Or can I mess with it? If I have to knock 3 times, can I knock 4 times? Can I just mess with it a little bit? That's defense. And then offense is OCD is not bothering me right now. And I go through this in my workbook too. I have a Crushing OCD workbook for kids, and it's for kids ages 8 to 12. And I teach them this offense and defense as well. I also teach it in my courses, but I do think it's a really important thing for kids to understand that there's 2 ways we're approaching OCD, offense and defense. And offense is OCD is not bothering me right now, and I'm going to purposely do an exposure to upset OCD. And so these exposures go back to the core fear. So if I am afraid that my parents are going to die if I don't say I love you, I might come up with an agreement with them and say, you know, my OCD always says I have to say I love you twice. And so don't be alarmed, but I'm going to say, you know, I hope you die tonight. And maybe I say it funny or sarcastic, you know, because that seems really dark. But I'm going to purposely do something that upsets OCD. Or maybe if I'm afraid of throwing up, I'm going to look at pictures of throw up. Or I'm going to do exposures around emetophobia where and that looks different for each person. But, you know, sometimes you look at pictures, sometimes you look at cartoons, you build up your tolerance of looking at that. If it's a loss of control, then maybe I'm going to purposely lose some sort of control in a public environment. That could look like I have a bunch of coins and I just drop them on the floor and I make a scene. That's similar to throw up for a person who's afraid of losing control and being embarrassed by doing something. And so you can actually emulate that feeling and that core fear without actually having to do the thing that you're the most worried about. So that's something to talk about with a therapist to develop those kind of offense exposures that address the core fear, but that gives you an idea of where you should be headed. So that was a lot for today. I hope that you found that helpful. I will link those 2 YouTube videos, the one on magical thinking and the one on offense and defense. So you can show your kids those and you can watch them as well. And I hope that you're finding my podcast helpful and informative. And if you are, don't forget to hit a star and rate it. I haven't gotten a review in actually quite a while. So if you've been listening to this podcast for a long time and you've never written a review, feel free to pay it forward and take 10 seconds to write a review. I greatly appreciate it. I used to go to this website that would actually show me all reviews globally, and they took that website down. So if you're leaving a review and I'm not reading it, it is because I'm really only able to look at Apple, unfortunately, and that is really annoying. And if any of you know how to find other reviews, let me know, because I'm like, how do I see that? But anyway, I have this routine where I do like to read a review at the end of my podcast, and I haven't been able to because I haven't had any new ones on Apple for a long time. So if you're on Apple and you've been listening to me for a while, if you write a review, I'll be reading yours next time. I am about a month out as far as I batch these, and so this won't come out for another month. So if you leave a review, just know that there's a delay because they don't come out at the time that I'm recording them. But I hope that you find the sparkle in everything you do, and I'll talk to you again next Tuesday. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. To get additional support raising a child with anxiety or OCD, visit Natasha's online school of on-demand classes at atparentingsurvivalschool.com.